Hello and welcome. We have a very important and I am sure you'll find interesting show tonight. I'm going to be talking with a doctor who has spent most of the last 30 years in the Middle East, in Syria, in Jordan. We'll find out more about other countries. But Curt Rhodes is my guest. He went over in the early 80s,
yes.
And was in Beirut when the attack
Yes.
occurred on our Marines, and got very involved in working as a physician with the community clinics there and helping the wounded. Out of that experience came a big idea. He started a foundation called Questscope. So we're going to talk about his foundation, about the situation today in Syria, and I know we're not going to have enough time because there's so much to talk about, Curt, but tell us a bit more about what brought you to the Middle East in the beginning. Not all American doctors end up abroad as young doctors.
As young doctors,
right.
Yeah. Well, I accepted a position at the American University of Beirut in 1981.
In public health?
In public health.
Right.
I was the assistant dean in the School of Public Health at the American University of Beirut. So my wife and I and our two little girls moved to Beirut in 1981. So we were there in 1982 when the Israeli Defense League attacked West Beirut. And for about 4 months, we were shelled and bombed. And during that time, the university didn't offer classes, so I volunteered to do triage in the city, as they called it, of West Beirut at that time. When that period was over and the fighters were allowed to leave and their families were allowed to go home to the Palestinian camps around the city, almost all of the people that I knew and had provided services for were killed.
Ooh.
And I remember thinking, how could people who were of no consequence, they were not dangerous,
Just
be erased
innocent
so
people.
easily? So that's why we have on our business cards and our stationery today, our motto is to put the last first. So that's
So
where
there's the
that's where it came
beginning,
from.
the origin of Questscopes.
Yes.
A human reaction question here. When all this was going on in 82 and 83, were you and your wife tempted to say, we've got to get back to where life is safer? Or were you committed early on to
That's a good
staying?
question. I don't think we ever thought about getting somewhere safer.
That's so interesting
You know?
to me.
I just don't think we thought that. Yeah.
So something in you was really ready to stick around there for the long haul.
Because after you see stuff like that happen, either you have to kind of pack it away somewhere and ignore it, or it has to change you. And so once it begins to change you, then you don't look back.
You're hooked, right?
You're hooked.
30 years have gone by. What are you doing now, Curt, in terms of life over there? You said you're there 70% of the time.
Correct.
So that's a big, big hunk. Are you primarily living in Jordan now? Am I?
I live primarily in Jordan. I do travel in the region, and I was just in Syria in December for a couple of weeks. Because we have a large group of staff and volunteers and our partner there. So, and I love Syria.
And Questscope's there, and well, tell us just a little more about Questscopes before we move on. I want to jump in and talk about Syria in great depth, but tell us more about your goals with Questscopes now.
Yeah, the goal of Questscope is to take marginalized young people and give them the relationship and the experiences and some of the resources that they need to not be marginalized anymore. So when you see a kid trying to wash a windshield at a stoplight because he would like some money, that child, that young person is part of an ecosystem, and that's where he shows up. So we're interested in what's going on behind there, how do we find the roots of the problem, how we engage ourselves with the community so that that young person has a different ecosystem to be a part of. So we've worked with incarcerated youth, pre and post-incarcerated youth, children who've dropped out of school, children who just for some reason got in trouble for no reason at all, and now most recently refugee youth and their families.
And I'm guessing a lot of these kids are not in school for various reasons.
Between 40 and 60% of them are not in school.
And that is such a scary statistic in terms of their long-term futures.
Well, yeah, their trajectory is going to go like this,
Right.
not like this. Yeah.
Right. Did you early on, Curt, decide to work mostly with youth or focus on the issues related to youth?
Well, it's interesting. If you focus on a young person, then the family's going to be interested in what you're doing with them.
Right.
So you've drawn the family in, but the community will be interested in what's going on with the family around the young person. So really the young person is the central point to an entire range of interventions that we can do.
So you do involve the family too with a lot of your programming.
Yeah.
That's important.
It doesn't work without mama.
No, well, or daddy, but
or dad, but mamas are really key. Or
grandma or grandpa,
Yeah,
somebody's got to be involved,
Right.
right? Wow. And I also want to just hit on your connection with what we used to call the American Refugee Committee, which is now Alight. You are considered a subsidiary. Can you explain that briefly?
Yeah, the American Refugee Committee, already now known as Alight, the chairman and the CEO and president of Alight spoke to me maybe 8 years ago. He said, you know, we're interested in doing things in the Middle East. Why would we need to completely learn 5 or 10 years of expensive lessons? Why don't we just cooperate with you? Mm-hmm. And why don't we cooperate in-house rather than outside of the house? So that's when we said, fine, we can become a subsidiary, maintain our autonomy of programming, but you guys are really strong in what you call the back office. So the HR systems, the finance systems, which if you want to grow as a young organization, need that kind of support. So that we are a subsidiary of Alight, but we have our separate name and our separate board and our separate autonomy.
For some of you who have seen some of my shows, Daniel Wordsworth is the executive director of Alight, and he's been on. They are doing doing great work.
We all, yeah.
You all, right? You all, and you're from North Carolina, so
I'm originally from North Carolina.
Fall into that
Yes.
jargon, right? Well, you and I were talking earlier, and you said, Mary, the world of refugees has changed a lot. There's no longer really a place for most refugees to go. Say more about that, because I don't know if people here in Minnesota would have realized that to the degree that you're explaining it to me.
Because there was a time in the refugee response system that you could work on one of 3 solutions. You could find another place for a refugee to go, so a third country settlement. You could help the refugee return home. You could repatriate them, or you could help them settle in the country in which they were refugees. At this time of history, in this world that we live in, you can't go home, you can't stay here, and you can't go anywhere else as a refugee.
So you're up against a rock and a hard place.
You're between a rock and a hard place, yeah.
That's just discouraging for them.
Well, it would be terribly discouraging. So what do? You can't just sit around with people and say, well, it's too bad, nothing can happen to you. You're kind of in a holding pattern the rest of your life. So instead you think of people as solutions, not as problems. All right? And one of the things that you as a refugee can do as a solution is we can help you figure out how to negotiate uncertainty. Not how to put you in a certain place, but to negotiate the uncertainty of life, to negotiate the fragility of the society around you, which may also be having its own economic troubles, maybe also having its own social troubles. So we want to enable you to have the skills and understanding to look at the choppy water and know what kind of boat to put in it.
How do you do that just in a programmatic way? I mean, that's a huge goal, and it seems to me, with my social worker hat, that that takes a lot of resilience, which has been kind of, for a lot of people who are refugees, worn down by the years that they've been under stress. How do you
that's really
approach
true.
that?
In the largest refugee camp for Syrians in Jordan, in a place called Zatari in the north of Syria, the camp was made for about 60,000 people, and at one time it had 125,000 people in it,
Wow.
in tents or in house trailers, caravans.
Sort of 50-50 tents and house trailers?
It started at all tents, and
Okay.
it's now all caravans. So
Oh,
there
it
was a
is.
period of time
Okay.
when there were changes. And these people were engineers and lawyers and nurses and librarians and accountants. So you suddenly put them in a situation where they don't know how to be refugees.
Right. They weren't trained to do that.
There's no degree in refugee, in university.
Right.
So this is what it means to look at people as solutions. You have skills and background that we can now say, okay, you're going to have to learn to be a social worker. You're going to have to learn to be a community organizer. You're going to have to learn the skills of small business management so that you can learn how to administer aid for your own people. You can learn how to design programs, and you can learn how to monitor and evaluate. So that's what we've done with these people.
How do you bring them in? How do they know about Questscopes?
Coffee. You drink coffee and you talk, and people hear and people come. And one of the key things that happens in a war is you lose all your relationships. So anytime you're willing to sit with someone who's lost all their relationships and say, no, I'm here for you. And I'll be here tomorrow when you come back for the second cup of coffee. That rebuilds that human bond that begins to change everything in me and in you.
I mean, that's a beautiful thing that happens then, isn't it? Between two people. And you've got a big staff. I was looking at your website, and how many people are working with Questscope?
In Jordan, we have 80 staff and about 1,000 volunteers, because our situation is smaller than in Syria. In Syria, with our partner organization that we helped found, we have 3,500 volunteers full-time and 1,500 staff.
Wow. While we're talking numbers, I want to share some numbers with the audience that you and I have talked about. The population, thinking of Syria now, about 21 million, give
more
or
or
take.
less,
Which you said, you put it in perspective.
Yeah.
Tell the viewers what you said.
At least for 2010 statistics, Syria and New York State are about the same. New York had 19 million, Syria had 21 million.
Okay. And geographically, what's the difference or relative?
The size of Syria is
Right.
about the size of Indiana.
It is, okay. That's a good
Yeah.
visual for us here in the
Right.
Midwest. And right now, about half the people in Syria are either refugees or displaced.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah, because we think about refugees, anybody who's running from some kind of conflict is a refugee. But if you're inside your own country, you're called a displaced person.
Right.
You're only counted as a refugee if you're outside of your country. So half of the Syrians have either been made refugees or they are displaced.
And the ones who are refugees, Curt, a lot of them have gone to Europe. A lot of them have gone to Turkey, Turkey being the #1 place that
Right.
Syrians have ended up.
Yep.
What is it like for them in Turkey? I mean, Turkey's taken in way more people than most other countries. How are they treating the Syrians?
Turkey has 3.6 million Syrians.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the next number down is Lebanon, which has 1 million. I've been to Turkey, I've been to some of these places. You have urban refugees, so people who have to find their own apartments. They have to find their own living situations. They have to figure out where they will put their kids in school. How will they...
Just like if you moved here in the U.S. and...
Well, yeah, like take everybody from Minneapolis and send them to Indianapolis with nothing and tell them, figure it out.
Yeah.
All right? That's kind of scary.
Overwhelming.
So you also have camps in Turkey, which originally were looked after by the army. And they were exceptionally good situations for refugees. Now, with so many refugees, it has overwhelmed the whole situation. And the Turkish government is trying to figure out, how do we get people back into Syria?
And are the people that are the Syrian refugees in Turkey wanting to go back to Syria at this point?
Not primarily right now.
Afraid,
Things would
I
have to
bet.
calm down a bit. You need to at least know that there's no fighting going on in your neighborhood.
Yeah. I saw just some pictures recently of children in Syria, and they had what I would call kind of glazed expressions. And the narrator of this feature on TV said these children, you know, had hope years and years ago. As they've gotten older, they've given up hope because of the unending civil war. And that's just such a sad reality to try and grasp. And then the practical water situation. Tell us how that is being handled and what's going on in the Middle East in general.
Well, yeah, and water depends. If you're going to turn your tap on, that depends on a pipe. And that pipe depends on a bigger pipe, and that pipe depends on a pumping station. So water is the result of a system. And once you disrupt that system, then you're kind of screwed, you know? Because everybody doesn't have a well in their backyard to take water out of. So water is a big issue for refugees outside the country, because the water services were not ready to handle so many people, and inside the country as a displaced person where the systems have been destroyed. Water is a big deal.
And for the people who are just living still in their own communities, I'm guessing it's a problem too.
The same system that was
be
destroyed also means you don't have water. Everybody's in the same boat.
Issue with that.
Water and electricity is
and electricity
a big deal.
too, which I hadn't realized was as extensive a problem as it is.
Yeah.
So, in the winter months, it's not good, is it?
Not good. Not good.
I read about a school principal just this week who woke up in the tent with his wife and little boys and 2-year-old daughter, and the daughter had frozen to death in the tent. Unbeknownst to them, it probably got colder than they thought it was going to. And she probably wasn't just warm enough, but, you know, things like that.
Because the latitude of Syria is kind of like the latitude of Ohio.
Oh, it is.
So Ohio is pretty cold in the winter.
Yeah, it can get very cold, can't it?
Yeah.
So all these issues are just overwhelming. Then you add on to these things human rights abuses, the numbers of cases of young girls being raped and women. How do you put that all in perspective when you're trying to help the people?
I mean, when you receive people who've managed to escape from a situation, from either a siege or a battle or something like that, the first thing that you remember is that the most vulnerable are your biggest responsibility. And those will generally be women and children. And so one of the first things that you do is that when you welcome them, remember I said earlier, this relationship thing to reestablish,
is so important.
You ask people questions and you inquire about their circumstances and what they want. And we have a group of social workers, we have medical workers, we have, you know, those kinds of people that can help. But the first line person is the one who welcomes, all right? And if it's a particularly serious medical need, then you have the medical care that you can offer. But that person who welcomes you and lets you know that with us, you're going to be safe is a really critical step with, we call it protection of refugees and displaced persons.
Are most women and children, are they mostly, the refugee group, are they mostly with men in their family that have survived also being part of the family unit, or are a lot of them separated from their spouse or their uncle or their grandpa, whoever, because of the war?
I would say, just looking at the UN statistics from a high level, probably 60% of all the families don't have men in them. They're women-headed households.
Wow.
So that's a loose statistic,
yeah,
but
that
means women are much on their own.
Right, and the kids are then really dependent on mommy to hold things together.
One of the, in every situation there's something to be grateful for. One of the things this opens up is things for women to do that they would not have done before. So women are becoming plumbers and electricians and carpenters because there are no men for those jobs, or not enough. So they are new niches to fill.
Kind of like here during World War II.
Oh, no, yeah, very much so. And it's changing the dynamic of women's engagement in their society.
Well, I'm getting the time cue. We only have 5 minutes left, Curt. What can we do, we as Minnesotans, primarily who are seeing this show, Midwesterners, in this really tough situation that isn't that far away from us? I think we can sometimes forget that we're just a plane ride away.
Yes. Well, I am a person who adopted Minnesota, okay? I'm not a native Minnesotan. And that means I'm excessively loyal to who I adopted, right? So I'm very aware of the Minnesota resettlement programs that the State Department of Human Services provides, and the various organizations from Lutheran Social Services. I mean, there's Lutherans everywhere, and the Minnesota Council of Churches, the Winona Diocese, and the Catholic Charities. Also, the International Institute of Minnesota is a very, very strong advocate for both refugees and displaced people. Refugees primarily inside Minnesota, but not limited to. We also have...
So we could support these organizations via donations?
Definitely. And volunteerism.
And volunteerism,
yeah, there's a Center for Victims of Torture, the ARAHA, the American Relief Agency for the Horn of Africa, and there is Alight, and there is Questscope. So all of us are the beneficiaries of this spirit of volunteerism and reaching out to your neighbor to help. And all of us benefit from donations of time, effort, energy, and advocacy. Right
now, because of Trump's position of not wanting to take refugees into our country, we don't have as many coming in as we could be taking, obviously. I mean, what's the number right now in terms of Syrians? Do you have that?
Yeah, I have that number. In 2018, we have taken in 62 Syrians.
The whole country?
The whole country.
The whole country.
In 2017, it was 7,000. In 2016, it was 13,000.
And remind us again, how many has Jordan taken in, Turkey?
Jordan has taken in 700,000, and Turkey has taken in 3.6 million.
What's wrong with this picture, huh?
There's something skewed about this picture, and we simply have to let our leaders know that it doesn't have to be like this and shouldn't be like this.
So, speaking up, going to the voting
absolutely. It's this week, it's going to be this
right, our
next
primary
week.
Time. Do you feel that any of our Democratic presidential candidates are more sensitive and tuned into the issues that we're talking about tonight?
Well, I think so. If you look at the democratic policy for refugees, it's always been a more open policy.
Right.
And then this council in Minnesota said in the past decade, refugees have brought in $63 billion more than the cost it was to help them settle.
And you said that was in Minnesota
Just in
alone?
Minnesota alone.
Say that again. That's just shocking.
I'll read this thing. The refugees brought in $63 billion more in government revenues in a decade than they cost. They are an important part of the economic engine for Minnesota.
That's
So
just
it's to our benefit to bring them.
big number, isn't it? Wow. Real quickly, the website for Questscopes.
Yes.
Would you give that?
Yes,
and we'll
it's-
put it on the screen.
Good. It's Questscope, QUESTSCOPE.org.
Okay.
Questscope.org.
So we can find out via that how to support your group more.
Exactly.
How to support your great work. And Alight, do you know the website?
I think it's Alight. If it's Alight.org, I think.
That's what I think. We'll put that on
Yeah.
the screen too, so you can have that right there. Well, thank you so much,
It was
Curt,
my pleasure.
to come
Okay.
for coming down, and so much I wanted to ask, we didn't have time, but thank you again for the great work you're doing with Questscopes, and your personal dedication is
Thank you.
really something.
You're very gracious.
And thank you for listening and being with us tonight. Check out Questscopes and share some of the facts and interesting knowledge that we've garnered tonight. It's really important stuff. I'll see you next week. Until then, have a good week.